Here we are at Elements of Art, Part 2. I'm starting with Escher's Metamorphosis, and I'm fascinated by his work of how he uses value to create his work with light and dark. And since we just really talked about that in color, this also accentuates it when we use black and white, and adding black and adding white in that value. So take a look at this as we move on to our next element of art. Our next element of art is shape, and shape is an area enclosed by a line. It is two-dimensional and can be geometric or organic. Look at this piece that we're looking at. It's by Pablo Picasso. It's called Three Musicians. Can you find three musicians in this? Shapes are flat, and some shapes are geometric, such as squares, circles, triangles, rectangles, and other shapes. The abstract painting has three people that are simplified into an arrangement of flat shapes. The artist is using a variety of shapes, creating the painting that really looks like sort of a puzzle. Look for these shape varieties. Look for medium and small shapes. Look for rectangles. Look for some circular type shapes in that. Look for geometric shapes and some flat shapes. Look how Picasso uses light and dark, and look for the outline shapes and the unoutlined shapes. When line meets, shapes are formed. Shapes are flat. Again, I'm repeating this, but right now we're looking at two types of shapes. We are looking at the rectilinear shapes, and we are looking at curvilinear shapes. Your curvilinear tend to have rounded edges. These are also shapes that are called organic shapes, or that would be found in natural settings. They are, when you think of organic shapes, think of leaves, animals, plants, shapes. Those are all organic. It's very rare that you are going to see rounded circle shapes in the rectilinear type of shapes or geometric. All shapes are either positive or negative. The subject matter is the representational objects that they are usually positive, like the sheep. Look at the sheep, and that is your positive shape, and the background is the negative shape, the black area. In the non-objective piece by B.J. White, this is a kimono. Can you see the kimono? The belt, the red is the big part of the kimono. I can speak. It's early. Anyway, the negative shapes around the kimono, which happen to be white. So look at the red, and then your negative shapes are going to be the white. I found this piece, and I really wanted to bring it to your attention because I want you to notice how the black shapes are just as interesting as the white positive shapes. It gives this painting more depth than it would have of just having the white face and then a black background. It uses the whole entire piece to bring out all of the shapes in black and in white. This painting is called Marathon by Mango Hoff. I want you to notice the flat people at the start of the marathon race. Can you identify if they're geometric or organic? Where are the negative shapes? And would it all look the same if the negative space was all white? Our next element of art is form. Form is three-dimensional. It will have height, thickness, and width, versus shape, which is flat and two-dimensional. People confuse these things, so think form is three-dimensional. Form, three-dimensional, shape, two. This sculpture contains what kind of shapes? Geometric or organic, if you had to guess which one it is? even though we're looking at a photo of this, this is still our form. Well, this is organic because of the rounded areas and the assembly of what people might find in the sea. And this is this artist's non-representational look at sea forms. These are rectilineal shapes. And I bring this up because we are going to talk a little bit about architecture, not a lot, but rectilineal forms have geometric sides and they have angular corners and edges. Except in the background, if you look, there's a more rounded building that has some curvilinear shapes. But still it's going up and down. And remember, architecture is going to be a form and not a shape. This is a painting that someone did that had curvilinear or natural forms that show in nature. Curvilinear forms are free form, usually curving along edges, and it's very similar to what we discussed about organic shapes, but now we have forms instead, three-dimensional, because forms are three-dimensional. I'd like to talk a little bit about bas-relief sculpture because this is also a form, but it's just carved above the surface. This is a Greek bas-relief. It says B-A-S, but it's pronounced bas-relief. And a bas-relief are images carved from a slab of marble, but they're not carved out completely. This type is also called a low-relief sculpture, which was very popular on ancient buildings, and they were used to decorate doorways and facades and columns. And so as you look at some of the paintings and the photographs in your book, start looking for these bas-relief sculptures. They're very detailed. Now this is called a full relief sculpture. A full relief sculpture is a sculpture that I can walk around and see on all sides. This is a statue of David created by Michelangelo. This statue stands 15 feet tall, and I think the base is 3 or 4 feet tall. So it's 3 feet because I think the total statue stands at 18 feet. When you visit this statue, you're able to walk around the sculpture and see it from all sides, and this is truly a three-dimensional work. Last year, Michelangelo's David celebrated its 500th birthday. I saw this piece in Italy last year. It is truly an incredible piece of sculpture. It was hard for me to believe that this sculpture was speaking to me from 500 years ago. It really is just an impressive piece. If you ever get to go to Italy, you have to see Michelangelo's David. All right, I also wanted to talk about open forms and closed forms. Open form sculpture have negative space opening through the piece. And when you look at pottery as an open form, only if it has holes through it. The opening at the top does not make it an open form. And closed form sculptures and pottery have no negative space piercing through it. So looking at these three pieces, which one is open form and which one is closed form? Element of art. Next one is space. It is the illusion of objects having depth on the two-dimensional surface. Linear and aerial perspectives are used. The first characteristic of space is deep space, and this involves creating depth in a composition where your eye is led deep into the space of the composition. Now, I'm going to use another slide to show you through this, but look for what do you think in this painting makes this create deep space? Take the opportunity, stop and write down some of the things that might help this create deep space, and then I'm going to ask you, then I'm going to show you what that is, all right? So stop, write down 2 or 3 things max. What helps this create deep space? and then I'll show you what that does in a couple of 3 slides down the line. This painting by Georgia O'Keeffe, this is an oil on canvas, which is just phenomenal for me, is the opposite of deep space. It shows the subject matter very close with little or no negative space around it. The first one shows a little bit of a negative space, this close-up of this flower. The next flower is up close even more, and the third is so close that there is no negative space. And this is just a series of paintings of how Georgia O'Keeffe looks at plants and flowers, particularly flowers. Our third characteristic of space is infinite space. The depth appears to go on and on and on forever. This photo collage is a good example of this. When you go back to the horizon, remember what horizon is, and it seems to drift on and on from there into infinity. This is by an artist that's title is unknown and the artist is unknown, and I'm just fascinated with how this was put together with photography. Because if you look at it, it's a square or a rectangle of ocean and then black space and then a rectangle of ocean and then black space, and it's going back to the vanishing point, and it is just really an incredible piece. And then at the top, it's sky and then black and then sky and then black, and then it meets right at the horizon line. There are 2 ways of achieving deep space on a 2-dimensional surface. And if you look at this, again, I want you to look at this, and like I asked you to look at that first painting, and tell me how you think, or write down to yourself a couple of things, how this painting achieves deep space. Aerial perspective is a way to create depth on a 2-dimensional surface. Okay, don't confuse it with flying an airplane and looking down on that point of view. It's not that type of aerial space. This is aerial space as it refers to art and how 2-dimensional space looks or appears 3-dimensional. So the first thing we do in order to create that aerial space is a simple placement of objects where one is on top of the other and the one closest to us, and then we have one back behind it. The second one is overlapping with size and change, where we have all of the characters or the landscape overlapping, and we change the size of things. So think about that first painting you were looking at, and then think of the landscape painting, the city painting, and then the landscape. And the third thing is overlapping size and change with vertical placement. So if you look, the people that are closest to you are bigger, and as you look further back, the people get smaller, yet they're still overlapping, but we have a sense of depth. All right, aerial perspective. Remember that painting that I showed you by Robert Henry, Snow in New York? If you look at distant objects, they have less detail. This gives an illusion that they're further away. There's also a sort of haze that's over that. Think of when you're looking at mountains, how the farther you look, the more distance they look, and the more they appear light and hazy-like. That's aerial perspective. So we want to position things where things overlap, where the size matter, and also color will give us that aerial perspective. And so look at where the value changes detail and the overlapping contrast, and then the size change throughout the piece, and then the graded value of color that changes. That's what gives us this look of aerial perspective. The other way that we will really use aerial perspective is using warm and cool colors. Remember, we talked about warm and cool. So if you look at this painting, you can see the butterfly and you can see the flower very prominent. And then this artist used warm and cool colors to make the other flowers recede back in the background and give it this sort of hazy effect. If you look closely, you can see that those are sunflowers in the back. This is why distant mountains are usually painted light blue or purple, because that's what the eye perceives the further away things look for us at a distance. The second type of perspective is linear perspective. Linear perspective was devised by a Renaissance artist to show depth, to help accurately draw buildings, both exterior and interior, and other box-like form. Here's some terms that I would like for you to be familiar with. The horizon line is the place where the land and the sky meet. A plane, a picture plane, is a make-believe paper or canvas between you and the work you are illustrating or working with. The vanishing point is the single point on the horizon where all lines on the ground level seem to be coming together. One-point perspective has a vanishing point, a single vanishing point on the horizon line, and two-point perspective has two vanishing points on the horizon line, and then there's also three-point perspective. This is a Renaissance painting. We see Aristotle and Plato in the center in an intelligent discussion. Notice the use of one-point perspective in the structure of the building. The entire structure disappears to a vanishing point between Aristotle and Plato. Even the lines on the floor, look at the lines on the floor, extend to the point. There's only one two-point perspective, and that's the box that's turned in the lower position with the guy leaning his face on his hand. That's supposed to be Michelangelo, the pensive Michelangelo. The Renaissance is when linear perspective first got its start, and it's the first time buildings were drawn with an accurate perspective. I also wanted to look at negative and positive space on sculpture. We looked at it in art. Now, on sculpture, a space is the empty space, the negative space is an empty space or surface around the work of art. And the positive space is actually the space the work of art takes up. So Michelangelo would be positive space, and the space around him would be the negative space. The same as in this piece called Public Art Sculpture. Okay, we are in the home stretch. This is actually the very last element of art. And in this painting, the artist is using impasto technique. What is impasto technique? That's paint that's applied so heavily that if you touched the painting, it would feel rough to the touch. When you go to the museum, don't do that. Okay? All right. So, very thick paint was applied to the canvas in the face and on the jacket area of the painting. And it's really hard to see in this reproduction, but this is impasto, trust me. In other areas of the painting, he created a similar texture. These areas include his sleeve, where the dark and the light value changed because he wanted it to look like fabric, and his face, where he wanted his face to be textured and a weathered look of maybe a older man, older king who had been through a lot. I picked this painting because it's got four styles of painting, four textual, I think that's the word, painting techniques. All right, if we look at the upper left, that's called alla prima. Paint doesn't get blended together, and you use quick swirling brush strokes. In the upper right, it's called blended. The paint gets blended and mixed together, and the brush works the colors together. On the lower left, it's called scumbling. S-C-U-M-B-L-I-N-G, scumbling. Lightly passing one color of paint over others to build it up to show texture and give a blurred effect. Lower right is pointillism. The paint isn't blended, it is dotted or dabbed into the canvas, And colors usually, the eye usually mixes the colors together. But the closer you get to it, the more you can't see what the elements are, and the further you get away, then you can see more of the painting. In this, we have an apple and banana, and then we have the shadows of the apple and the shadows of the banana. So when we see a painting, usually that's implied texture. And I thought that Mykonos was by Gerald Brommer was a very good way to look at painting as implied texture. This painting has a lot of different implied textures. There's the brick wall, there's the road, there's the grass, there's the windmill. All of that is implied texture. But because of how the painter has used color and layered color and used color to, deceive our eye a little bit, then we really see the grass and the rock road and the rock wall. And then we have actual texture, which is the owl created by Lou Rankin. This is cement and sand, the bird being cement and the legs being steel, and the eye, and then the different glass eyes. So this three-dimensional work is actual texture that we can touch and we can see. We know it's not a real owl, but the different textures are the things that tend to appeal to us. I also wanted to speak a little bit about collage. Collage is a French term meaning cut and paste. These are two examples of collage compositions. The goats are made out of fabric, and some of it hang loose from this piece. And then the artist layers paint on top of them. The second piece is a collage that has metal and steel. And when we look at this collages, they often emphasize texture and contrast. And so this is what collage is. And your book, and as you look at some of your artists, are going to mention collage. So I wanted to make sure that I defined that for you and showed you what collage, an example of what collage looked like. This is also a type of impasto. If you can remember what that is, we just talked about that. Painting. This is a self-portrait of Oskar Kokoschka. This means that the painter painted a portrait of himself. Our most famous artist to do that was Rembrandt. If you read a little bit about Rembrandt, when you get into the Baroque period, he painted self-portraits of himself from a very young man to a very old man. We notice the thick application of the paint and the many colors that this artist used to accent the paint strokes to give it a textual quality of making us want to touch it. And what do you think the artist was trying to say by applying paint and color in this way? Because artists are very intentional in what they do. So what was this artist trying to say? Oh, goody. We're at the end of Elements of Art Part 2. So I hope that you have enjoyed this. If you want to go in on the sites and see where I retrieve some of my information, feel free to click on any of these sites. Some of them have activities. I know we're at the end of our Elements of Art, but take the opportunity to try and advance yourself a little bit beyond what I'm saying and what your book is saying. I wanted to leave you with this last piece, The Fur-Covered Cup, Saucer, and Spoon by Merritt Oppenheim. I'm thrown by this, and I'm thrown by it because just the thought of it would be yucky. And what Oppenheim was trying to get people to do was to talk about the art. And this would definitely make you talk about the art. Maybe not about the art itself, but just what would happen if I decided this was the only thing I had to eat out of. But I hope that you have enjoyed Elements of Art, and remember the Elements of Art. If you haven't been to the museum, this is a good way for you to start. Don't go to the museum until you've heard the principles of art, and also how do I analyze paintings, all right? So have a good day or a good evening, and I will talk to you on the other side.